So moving from one difficult question to another difficult question, child protection in tourism. It's an issue which there's a temptation to think this is so horrible, I don't want to acknowledge it. I don't want to therefore do anything about it. And I certainly don't want to talk to my customers about it because it's guaranteed to turn away business. I know you've done a lot around child protection in tourism and achieved a lot. How did you go about, talk to us a little bit some of the issues and talk to us about how you made some progress given, or maybe I'm wrong, that there's a reluctance in...
There's a massive reluctance to talk about it. And I think that in a way there are two separate or three parts of it. The first relates to the way in which tourists interact with kids in the street. I was in Cuba with a tour group, and what I constantly talked about in this group: don't give chewing gum and pens to children in the street. And in the end, there was only one member of the tour group who was doing it. And she was absolutely mobbed. I mean, these kids just attacked her. And in the end, I went in and rescued her. And the problem with that is it's taking kids out of school. It's making it more profitable to be out of school. And you see it with kids begging by the side of the road. Don't give to begging children, is the rule. The second area where there's a problem is around paedophilia. And this is the one that people don't want to talk about. But the reality is that paedophiles are able to do what they do abroad because they think they're less likely to get caught. And because the kind of behaviour you might engage in as a tourist, giving sweets to a child in the street, is not seen as potentially abusive. But that's the way a paedophile relationship will often start. But people find that really hard to talk about. TUI Netherlands did take the issue on. We gave them a Responsible Tourism Award for it. And more companies are doing it. But that's the one that people are embarrassed by. I argue that they should be far more embarrassed that a tourist sees something that they think is paedophile behaviour in their hotel. And again, we need tourists to be more rebellious and go and complain when they see things which shouldn't be accepted. But the third area, and the one that I've worked on most recently, is the orphanage tourism issue. And that's particularly difficult because people think orphanages are a good thing. But that story broke because one individual from concert in Cambodia came to WTM, and as he stood up, I'd invited him to speak, but as he stood up I realised I was going to have a problem because he got a long typewritten script and he proceeded to read it. And the argument he was making was that there were now more orphanages in Cambodia than there were 5 years ago, and there were less orphans because the war in Cambodia was further ago. So what was going on? And it turned out to be that children were being trafficked, purchased from their parents and brought to tourist areas, put in orphanages because it was so lucrative to run an orphanage. And Talib Rifai, the Secretary General of UN WTO, stood up to speak after him, tore up the speech he'd been going to give, and responded to what had just been said. And that's really how it happened. It was one individual having the courage to bring the issue up at the World Travel Market made that difference. But that was in 2011, I think. 5 years on, we're still battling. There are still companies in Britain who are sending tourists to orphanages. Sure. Which I find extraordinary because they cannot be sure that there are no trafficked children in those orphanages. And when one of those stories breaks and it's demonstrated that they've been taking tourists and paying money into orphanages which contain trafficked children, they will need to deal with the aftermath of that. And this is the responsibility and the holding to accountability argument that we talked about before. The tourists will be horrified by the fact that they have been to those orphanages, that they have contributed, either directly or indirectly by visiting, to maintaining a place which contains trafficked children.
I mean, as you know, as we became aware of this at Responsible Travel, we looked into it and discontinued selling any orphanage tourism.
How did your members respond to that?
It was a struggle. It was a struggle because there are many tourism businesses and there are many tourists who feel they're doing a fantastic thing by supporting these orphanages.
Yeah.
But when we looked into it in detail, you see not just the issues you've mentioned, but also the repeated abandonment, which is a syndrome that the kids get as they get hugged and loved by one volunteer after another who then departs after a few days. And you speak to the experts and you learn very quickly that if you want to do good as a tourist, what you should be doing is supporting the parents in keeping that child at home, because always the best place for that child, or the best route for that child, is to try to keep them in the home environment as best you can rather than put them in an orphanage. But of course, for the tourism industry, to market an orphanage is a lot easier, and hugging a child who gives them some love is a lot easier than marketing the idea that you won't have the proximity with the child, you shouldn't have the proximity with the child, and you should be supporting the parents in keeping the child at home.
I agree with all of that, and I think one of the things that we need to remind ourselves and all tourists of is that if you couldn't do this at home, why do you think it's okay for you to do it when you're abroad? We don't have very many orphanages, and we certainly don't allow people to go in and hug an orphan or take tourist groups around.
No.
I often wonder what would happen if I turned up with a coachload of Gambian tourists at the local child playgroup and said, can my group come in and meet the children, and would they perform for us? Well, I think we know what the answer to that would be, and rightly so. But somehow it's okay to do it in other people's countries, and that for me is this question of equality and respect and hypocrisy, which we see so often.
It reminds me of that event that you and I were at World Travel Market event, when there was a debate about volunteering, and somebody who was representing a big group of volunteering companies stood up and told the room that the main purpose of volunteering was to improve the CVs of young people, young British people, and we needed to remember that. And I remember that person being shouted down effectively from the stage by people saying, no, the main purpose of volunteering is to do some good for somebody else. And I think that sums up the issue that we see in many places.